Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Tim McFeeley. From June 1989 to January 1995, Tim McFeeley served as the executive director of the Human Rights Campaign in Washington, D.C. Prior to his service at HRC, Tim practiced law in Boston from 1972 until 1989, and since leaving HRC, he has led and consulted with other mission-driven nonprofit organizations advancing social justice causes. Currently, Tim is an executive search consultant and lives with his husband in Provincetown, Massachusetts. I welcome Tim McFeeley to Savage Minds. The era of 1989 until 1995, when you were at the HRC, was a very important moment for me in time because I had just the year before, in 1988, moved to New York City. I got very active politically within various human rights groups, one of which was ACT UP. And we were still in the throes of the AIDS crisis at the States at that time. Could you speak a bit about what you were doing at the Human Rights Campaign in Washington, what the mandate was, and the important issues of the day during your time?
Yes, thank you. It it is quite a long time ago, but a lot of this is pretty vivid. In 1989, of course, that I came to the Human Rights Campaign as its executive director in June of 1989. There was one big, huge item on the agenda, and that it was having the federal government do something positive about HIV/AIDS. It was a life or death uh, priority, of course. People were dying, and the federal government was not doing much, neither were the state government. So it superseded all other issues. There were other issues, of course, on the agenda around employment discrimination and so forth. Sodomy laws were still in effect in many states, essentially criminalizing sex between consenting adults. But the major overriding priority was HIV/AIDS in terms of discriminating against people who were sick, in terms of investing more money in cures and prevention, and really getting people involved in a positive way and not a negative way.
By 1989, it was the end of Reagan's time in office. And if I recall correctly, Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until his last year in office. So we're talking about a president, even though he was in Hollywood in his earlier years of life, bizarrely was very good friends with Rock Hudson, who sort of marked that era as well. As Randy Schultz says, there was AIDS before Rock Hudson and there was AIDS after Rock Hudson, in the way that Americans came to see the disease. And then you have this president who, despite his personal knowledge of people suffering with AIDS, put, for instance, Legionnaire's disease and cures on the table long before that of AIDS. What was the biggest challenge around AIDS with the HRC at the time? Was it medication? Was it other aspects of healthcare?
Yes, well, there were so many aspects of it. I mean, on the one hand, we wanted to find resources to help people who were suffering and who were having these opportunistic infections. In addition, in trying to prevent and educate people was pretty difficult if the leaders would not even speak the name. Reagan was a genius at compartmentalizing and projecting an image publicly that didn't acknowledge his own private feelings and contacts with people in Hollywood and elsewhere who were suffering, or he knew people who were suffering. Um, it was a matter foremost of science. I mean, that was the only way to find our way out of this. But equally important is education, education around prevention, education around stigma, education around, you know, the, helping people and their families who had this disease. So many people in the closet came out during that time because they became sick. And many, I mean, the stories are replete where many people suffered alone, their families abandoned them, their friends abandoned them. And if they were lucky, they had some healthcare providers who understood, but many didn't, and it was very tragic. And people simply were dying. I mean, we went to lots of funerals.
Well, I later did work in the 90s with gay men's health crisis when the demographic of AIDS was changing. And that would have been towards the end of your time at the HRC when Crixivan hadn't yet received FDA approval, but it was on the verge of getting there. And these were protease inhibitors as opposed to the older treatment of AZT. What changed for then what you were doing at the organization? Also, I should mention around 95 and even 94, the demographics of who was struck hardest by AIDS shifted, where AIDS started to go into much more into the heterosexual community, largely in the US, the Latino and African American communities.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Backing up from '94 a bit. Um, in '89, George Herbert Walker Bush became president. He did talk about AIDS. He was being pushed by some of his supporters in the business community because businesses were affected as their workers became ill. So there was a change at that point. He was talking the words, but he wasn't putting a lot of resources in it. What I wanted to get to was that there was a critical election in 1992 for president, and the gay community was very much behind Bill Clinton, and he was elected, and he was courageous in the sense of not only talking about HIV/AIDS, but talking about the role of the federal government in pushing this forward. Um, and it really was a change. Now, back in 1990, under Bush, certain things did happen. I mean, that was the year that the Ryan White CARES Act was passed. That provided direct federal money to cities that were severely impacted, such as New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, others. It was uh, it was a great victory. It was a bipartisan supported, and it was signed by the president and named after this young man. Of course, not a gay person. It was much more acceptable to name it after a child who had a blood transfusion and contacted HIV.
That was Ryan White, right?
Yes, Ryan White Act, right, in 1990. Also in 1990, collaterally but importantly, um, the federal government passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protected people with disabilities from employment discrimination and other forms of discrimination. And within that act, within the Americans with Disabilities Act, was people with HIV were protected. Um, the ignorant people tried very much at the last minute to carve out an exception for people with HIV who were in the food industry. In other words, waiters and chefs and people who might work in restaurants. This was all pushed by the National Restaurant Association because there was a stigma around that they felt people wouldn't come to restaurants if they thought that they might can't contact HIV. Humorously, I don't think people were having sex in restaurants, but the stigma and the ignorance there was that, oh, if someone touched my plate, I could become infected. Um, Back to the main thread here, the as this this legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was almost finished, uh, the, the, the ignorant people tried to carve out this exception for people with HIV. We fought that and we won. It was a great victory. It sounds like a very small piece of the action, but it was more than protecting these workers and making sure they were covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was all about stigma. It was all about education. It was all about um, making sure people understood that, people were not getting HIV through normal contact with their neighbors and people that they might come in contact with. So those are two very important pieces of legislation in 1990 that was signed by by Bush. um, 92 was a change with the election of Clinton, and more money started to flow into cities through the Ryan White Care Act, and also through the investments at the National Institutes of Health.
Can you speak more broadly to some of the issues that the HRC was dealing with at the time outside of AIDS? For instance, lesbian and gay rights was something that was on the table from the beginning, but were bisexual rights on the table, or did those have to be introduced as well?
There was no explicit movement about bisexual rights. People were included. The issues came up. It was it was it was analyzed as well. Bisexuals are discriminated against and face hardships to the extent that they're identified as homosexual. Nobody was discriminating against them because they were in those moments of their life that they were heterosexual. I think it was that aspect. They were sort of like almost homosexual, so they were also being discriminated against. That may not be acceptable to bisexuals. I fully embrace the idea that people do have sexual orientations that are not bipolar, or that are not exactly one or the other on the scale. But there were other issues. A big issue that came up in 92 and 93, which it had been around for a while. It ties a little bit to your question, Julian, about bisexual coverage, and that was the so-called gays in the military. So this arose not through the agenda of HRC or others in particular. There was always a task force or an initiative that was largely powered through the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, as well as the National Organization of Women and other feminist groups around gays in the military. And I say other feminist groups because um, what was happening was that women in the United States military were being sexually harassed. And if they resisted the overtures, if you would say, or the assaults of men in the military, they were often labeled lesbian. Some of them were. And whether they were or were not, this was a major concern for feminist organizations, because the United States military was a very important way for women of color and women who came from limited means, who were poor and weren't able to secure an education, for them to enter the military and get an education and get ahead. It was an important pathway. So the gays in the military thing came up, but it came up largely not because of that effort, which was simmering in the background, but largely because of lawsuits that individual military personnel brought against the federal government, against the military, to when they were, if they were found out to be gay, they were discharged, and then lawsuits followed. And the one that I remember most was in the Meinhold case in 1992, and it was decided right after the election of Bill Clinton. And a reporter asked Bill Clinton, "What do you think about Judge Hatter's decision in the Meinhold case?" which declared the policy illegal, unconstitutional. Clinton said he agreed with the judge and that gays should be allowed to serve. And the proverbial fat was in the fire. I mean, that just blew up. It wasn't a major issue during the campaign, but it became a major issue in the winter of '92, heading into the inauguration of Clinton in January of 1993. That took us way off track, Julian. That issue became the burning issue for the first 6 months of the Clinton administration, when in fact the strategic plan was get Clinton elected and then really push on the HIV/AIDS agenda to get more money and to get support. And we felt that was logical and it was necessary. It was a priority. But all of a sudden, this other issue came up. And of course, the Republicans did everything they could to disable or to attack the new president with this, what they perceived to be a very, very unpopular position. So yes, that was sort of an issue. It was fundamentally based on the discrimination issue, that gays and lesbians should not be discriminated in employment, including military careers. So it was something we could not ignore. It was really very important. But that took us down a pathway that really used up our resources, money, personnel, and put things about HIV/AIDS sort of in the background. I remember when they finally came out with the Don't Ask, when Clinton accepted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that was crafted by Senator Nunn, and was a terrible policy, but it ended the debate for a while by adopting this policy. When he did that in July, I think July 21st or something like that of '93, I went along with others to the White House to protest. We were arrested. And when we were arrested and put into the police wagon, AIDS protesters, your ACT UP friends, were chanting "Throw the key away," and the reason was, and they were right. They were right. The reason was they were furious that these gay organizations, I was going to say powerful, we weren't that powerful, but it was all we had, right? Were using their resources on this military issue and not the AIDS issue. And so they were angry at me and other leaders and the organizations for not getting our priorities straight. And as I say, they were right. In our defense, it was very hard to ignore what was on the front pages around the military.
And did the HRC respond to that by changing priorities?
No.
Okay.
It's a good question. No, we couldn't change the subject, Julian, because it was so much on the minds. It was a powerful issue for people, about, they had relatives in the military or they served, and thinking that they were going to be in close contact with homosexuals, whether it was lesbians or gay men, was just, was just sort of this, issue that people wouldn't let go of, and the media didn't let go of, and our community pushed it. I mean, this was a huge issue, and I will say, it was the issue that raised money for us. So no, we weren't going to change priorities. We had so many fundraisers and raised so much money by saying we're fighting for you, we're fighting to allow gays and lesbians and to serve in the military. It was a very emotional issue. People, they put on their phony dog tags and danced all night. and contributed lots of money because this was a huge issue. And in the meantime, HIV/AIDS went kind of on the back burner. Or I won't say went to the back burner. It stayed on the back burner. It didn't get moved up in terms of priority the way this, because it was superseded by this issue.
But then we have the protease inhibitors that, like Indinavir, Crixivan, etc., were the new hope following AZT. AZT proving to be helpful to far fewer than in the end Indinavir was. Finally, it received FDA approval in 1996, and the world of AIDS was forever changed, as you well know. Now, you were no longer at the HRC after 1995, but as a fellow member of the gay community, you saw the changes, I'm sure, where the 80s was marked largely within the gay community, aside from organizing and protests, red ribbons. Then there were the flags and the quilt project, as you recall, in DC. That was in the 87, 88 era. Then Crixivan on the market by 96. And pretty much that was the death knell in a lot of organizations' mandate to tackle AIDS within the gay community. Because as I mentioned in our phone call the other week, I was doing research, sociological research for the gay men's health crisis in New York, where they had a huge struggle to face because their principal clientele were gay men. For several years, it was no longer gay men. It was African American, Latino New Yorkers living anywhere from Harlem to East Harlem to the Bronx. Huge numbers of their clientele came from there, and they were heterosexual. And they were women. They were no longer gay men, basically. And they were no longer white gay men. So I did a lot of focus groups because GMHC wanted to know if they should change their name from Gay Men's Health Crisis to something else. Now, it ended up being a wash in a sense. We got the data to them. We were able to show them that
Right.
indeed we had people, this one woman who's no longer amongst us, I'll never forget her, a Puerto Rican woman, and she said to me one day, until I had AIDS, I never thought in my life I would have anything in common with a white gay man from Nebraska. And she saw her children die. She died. And this project took me to other places because until that point, my work with AIDS was uniquely about gay men, not just white gay men. My brother died of AIDS. But I'm thinking about the way that NGOs had to suddenly shift mandates as well. Because when you have a mandate, any gay organization at the time couldn't leave AIDS off the table because that was the primary issue within the gay and lesbian community of our day. So what happened then when we've got all of these issues suddenly lifted in severity because of Crixivan and because of AIDS education? Gay men were fewer and fewer getting infected, but the infection rates were rising in heterosexual and poor communities. So all of these symbols of the gay community based around AIDS, from the quilt to the ribbon and even the flag. I mean, people see the flag today and think of it as only the gay flag, but at the time in the 80s, if you recall, it was sort of like the light at the end of the rainbow too. I mean, yes, Dorothy, yes, Stonewall riots, okay, the rainbow part, but there was that glimmer of hope. What changed within your final years at the HRC when maybe AIDS was less important, certainly after you left, but let's say 94, 95, what were some of the issues facing an organization that was to look straight in the face at issues affecting lesbian, gay, and bisexual men and women?
Yes, there definitely was a change, and science was conquering some of the issues, and the demographics were changing. We continued to work on lobbying issues, funding largely. But by then the sort of the political establishment at the local level was kicking in to get resources from the federal government. New York City, for instance, was lobbying not just for gay men, but for all the other people who were suffering from AIDS. And so that sort of kicked in, and that was much more powerful than we have. Going back, I hate to go back to this, but the gays in the military was, and I don't know where the expression came from, but we had our clocks cleaned. In other words, we were defeated with that. And it really threatened it was almost an existential issue for the Human Rights Campaign. And we had to regain and say, well, HIV/AIDS is not we're not the only ones carrying this now. We have allies, and we lost on the military. So what are we going to do? What is our priority here? Well, we went back to the basic discrimination issue around employment. What we had heard during the military debate was, why are you asking the federal government not to discriminate in the military when private employers, General Motors or AT&T or any private employer can still discriminate? Why don't you take care of that first? So we thought, yeah, that's a good idea. Several states, of course, have passed non-discrimination laws, but we needed a national one. And so we created a strategy that was different from what had gone on before. Before, the anti-discrimination law was basically an attempt to amend the Civil Rights Law of 1964. That was discouraged and wasn't really moving forward. So that's when we worked to introduce the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, ENDA, into Congress toward the end of 1993, early 94, with the imprimatur of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which was important because they carried that was a coalition of all civil rights groups. And this became a priority for them, and their lawyers worked on it. And so, to answer your question, we shifted and said we have to put resources now into ENDA and passing legislation that protects people nationally from discrimination in employment. Something, by the way, here we are in 2021, that still hasn't happened.
And then what about, when I speak with lesbians particularly, lesbians tell me that in organizations, not yours, they're speaking in general, a lot of them say we've never felt welcome within gay and lesbian organizations because even if they put us linguistically first in the title or subtitle, we're very little centered in some of the policies. Did the HRC at the time face criticism about excluding women's voices?
Absolutely. Yes, appropriately so. I mean, there were some very powerful women involved in HRC before me and during my time and subsequently. Um, Vivian Shapiro was chair of the board in New York City, Hillary Rosen in Washington. These were board members. But when I was hired, and there were choices. The board did not, when they hired me, they did not hire a lesbian. And many people felt that, after three white men running HRC, Steve and Dean, who founded it, then Vic Basil and myself, that it was time to, that women were being left out. We put on a very appropriate and important push to hire more lesbians on our staff and to recruit more lesbians for our board. I think our board was fairly equal in terms of gender diversity. But what it comes down to, so we paid lip service to it, and it was important, and we wanted lesbians to feel welcome. The lesbians have been extraordinarily important in the fight against AIDS and HIV. They were there. They were fighting with us. So there was no conscious, at least that I'm aware, there was no conscious bias that was acted upon to let's keep the women out. That was a part of it. What happened was there's so many things in politics in the United States. It's all about money and power. Power comes along with money. Um, so my organization, and I think others as well, was largely supported by gay men in terms of financially. Um, and we would say, yes, women's issues are important, but there was always the but. This is where the money came from. So they didn't have that power. I'll give you an example of where this. It takes a while to get through this story, but there's a point to it. I'll try to telescope it. Um, we had a strategy at HRC called that was through the Fairness Fund that used old-fashioned today it looks old-fashioned Western Union telegrams. So this is the days before email, before texting, before Twitter, before these kinds of social media. And what we would do is we would ask people at gay prides and so forth to sign up in advance and authorize us to send messages on their behalf through Western Union to their specific congressperson on AIDS, on issues that affected the gay community. um, and this gave us a powerful tool because oftentimes votes would come up and you didn't have enough time to communicate out to the community and then people to write letters or send their own to. We had sort of a bank that people authorized that we could use. Okay, so that was the strategy and it worked really well. And we could send 22 emails to a congressperson from people in their district, and that's a lot. I just made up the number 22. It could be 222. But we had these. Okay, so that was fine. So there was an issue. An issue came up around reproductive health and the anti-abortion thing or something like that. And I said we should use these messages to oppose this bill or to support women. Um, this was a woman's issue. This was a lesbian issue. This was a feminist issue. And we had a roaring argument inside HRC about whether or not we were authorized to use these messages that were pre-authorized by our constituents and paid for on an issue that, quote, was not a gay issue. And I just finally I listened to the debate. I said, well, we're going to. And we did. And we paid a price for it. I mean, there were many gay men, who said, I didn't authorize you to send a message on my behalf, for this. This is an important issue, but I didn't, blah, blah, blah. So we took a little bit of a hit for it. But overall, it was supported. That's one specific example of where, I and the organization had to make a decision that there were allied interests, and when we talk, if we truly are an organization that supports lesbian rights, it's got to be, we've got to use the tools that we have to support them.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. After you left, you did some work in executive search consultancy. You live in Provincetown. You live, in fact, in what many people have never seen, which is a sort of idyllic gay paradise, something I saw glimpses of, not Provincetown per se, but Fire Island and other areas. I also lived in New York, spent a great deal of time between the then gay center of either the West Village or Chelsea, but also I saw the fragmentation of these divisions, these ghettoizations between gay and straight worlds over the years I lived in New York, where as Clinton took office, as certain policies moved forward, AIDS became less of a death knell. I saw more of a laissez-faire attitude towards people who were anything but heterosexual. More and more, I'm speaking of New York, of course, not small town Ohio, people did not care. And dare I say, when I moved to New York in 1988, most people didn't care who was gay or straight because it's New York. But you could feel that more and more the country was loosening up as you would move in and out of the city, or people would come from small town Illinois to New York. You'd get a feeling that things were changing around the country. But one thing didn't change were these organizations that were set up to look out for our rights, not just HRC. GLAAD grew in size and prosperity. The HRC, I think, has a budget that you would not recognize today. It has grown beyond the ideals of the original years of these organizations, where let's try and do this one thing, and then that one mandate, once accomplished, grew into other mandates. So since the late 90s, these organizations, including organizations in other parts of the English speaking world, like Stonewall in the UK, had other mandates to meet. And while I was out of the US in the late 90s, one of the mandates that was added to the Human Rights Campaign was the transgender identity movement. And this is something, again, that lesbians have spoken to me about at length because they don't understand how gay rights organizations added this. Meanwhile, for the years they had been part of these organizations, they fought for visibility. So to them, given that at the time most of the transgender lobby itself was composed of mostly males who identified as not, these lesbians felt quite slighted by the fact that once again, they get not only second place on this menu of human rights, now there was a new lobby getting the second place after gay men, and they were at the bottom. Now, to repeat, you are no longer at the HRC, and many organizations, even in New York City, to include GMHC, started to cater more to the transgender group. Now, this causes problems within parts of the gay community, largely the lesbian sector of women who either feminist or not, but they feel like, hey, this has nothing to do with being gay. And this started to be something questioned by very few. I was not one of those few who questioned. I was busy doing queer theory. I was studying, doing my graduate work in New York, teaching queer theory, in fact. But then things went a bit awry in the 2000s, in the early noughts, when these organizations were vocally going after a certain target that even excluded any mention of gay or lesbian men and women. You can see on the GLAAD website today, for instance, that most of their mandate is uniquely about transgender identity. They barely say anything, or barely they have the word mentioned of gay or lesbian, hardly. And that is reflecting a larger consensus amongst other LGBT organizations around the country, and again, around Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., where gay and lesbian rights have been bizarrely viewed as already done. We've ticked that box, they're finished, they're good. Despite high rates of suicide amongst gay and lesbian youth still, somehow that's been something that's been considered, officially or not, figured out. And transgender narratives have been put on the table, depending on the organization, anywhere from around 98 through 2010-ish. In that area of about a dozen, 12 years, organizations have started to embrace this other agenda. Now, this goes hand in hand with the fact that many lesbian, gay, bisexual youth, adolescents, young adults have also themselves differently conceived of what sexuality means to them. Can you talk about what you've observed in terms of how the AIDS era sort of cemented this idea of sexuality, even to the point of bending to say, okay, bisexuals, you can come in. It wasn't always a welcome and warmy, fuzzy feeling for them, by the way. And then to the more recent years, post 2000, of these very same organizations that have even, I wouldn't say formally, but they have hand waved in other groups like transgender peoples because they've unofficially deemed that we have more rights and we need to work on this group's rights.
Yeah, well, I don't know how to unpack that. And again, as you pointed out, at this point, I'm an observer. I'm not a leader. I'm not a participant. As an observer, it did come on surprisingly strong. I think my hat is off to in terms of admiration around politics for the way the trans community has leveraged. They're not, they're not a big community. They don't have a lot of power, but they've leveraged what they have, and largely through what were traditionally gay and lesbian organizations like HRC. Because they are powerful organizations, and while the trans community you know um, have created and fostered their own unique organizations, which is great, they really wanted to be part of, if not one of the top priorities in terms of issues for organizations like GLAD or HRC. And you've mentioned others in other countries that I'm not familiar with. Um, it, I don't know that it's surprising or not. I mean, I guess let me make the case both ways. It's not surprising when an organization that was really formed and grew around the fact that people who are different in terms of their sexual orientation need protection, becomes welcoming, and an equally welcoming place for people who are different along another spectrum, which is gender identification and gender expression. And it was like, the word queer is one that embraces all that. We're different, we're queer, we're odd. It used to be because we were men who wanted to have sex with men, or we were women who were attracted to other women sexually and emotionally. But then there are these other folks who have uh, um, gender identity that are not um, being recognized, and they're queer, and so of course they should be part of us. Now, the other side of the argument is the gender identity issue is one that should have been logically um, embraced by feminist organizations, at least for the MTF. So, I mean, if people are being discriminated against because while born male, they identify as female and they want to present to the world as female and even undergo transformative surgeries, their rights should be protected by a feminist organization. I don't know what the comparable would be for. I think you can fit that in as well for FTM, for women who people who are born as women, and raised as women who would really identify as males. And again, this is a different expression of their rights. So it's a gender issue, not a sexual orientation issue. Those are the two sides of the argument. The one side being we welcome the trans community because they're queer, and we understand what it means to be different, i.e., queer. On the other hand, the other side of the argument is this is not our issue. This is an issue of gender. This is an issue for women's organizations to deal with.
You can imagine, though, I mean, you also come from that generation where youth kids, adolescents were told that they weren't really gay, they were the opposite sex.
Mhm.
So in this current era where you're having this combating ideology between gay conversion therapy has been outlawed in these states, that was gay conversion therapy, mind you. Now you have this notion that there's such a thing as transgender conversion therapy, meaning that if a therapist tries to speak to a young kid, he says that he feels like a girl, but it turns out he has homophobic parents who think that any boy who's gay must be a fairy. I'm using, in quotes, of course. And that therapist, if that therapist tries to address that maybe this kid has internalized his parents' homophobia, that therapist can go to prison in the states where this is being adopted. And so you have a very combative situation between two types of conversion therapy. One that tries to fight off any therapist who would suggest that kids are not gay, that they should pray more or just be heterosexual because that's the way God wanted it. That's the old school gay conversion therapy, as opposed to what the trans advocates are saying is transgender conversion therapy. Someone saying, hey, you're 16, you're attracted to boys, and you're saying that you feel like a girl and you have homophobic parents or you have a homophobic surrounding, et cetera, and you're not allowed to talk about that. So there's a real conflict in the terms of what some of this newer lobby is bringing to the table represents a lot of and has the hallmarks of old school homophobia. And for the feminists, similarly, the feminists tell me, but there is no internalized essential female. My whole life, especially lesbians tell me this, my whole life I've been butch. I've had to fight for my right to get a job, to have housing, because I've had people look at me because I don't wear frilly outfits. I don't wear dresses. I've never worn a dress, et cetera, et cetera. So how does this square when gay and lesbian organizations, or at least formally gay, lesbian, bisexual organizations, have now taken on this mantra of an ideology that actually works against gay and lesbian and bisexual people because it essentializes behavior and essence as being internal to the self with absolute resistance to changing the social fabric. In the days that you and I were getting arrested in the back of paddy wagons because of various issues related to AIDS, the bottom line for homophobes was, you're a butch woman, you should just be more girly or just become a man. Like, do like they do in Iran, become a man. You see what I'm saying? There's a stress there between the two sides.
Yeah, I mean, I'm out of my depth here. I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not a student of the of the trans movement currently. I'm just an observer and not a well informed observer. I have to say. Sorry to say, but it's true. So I'm not, I can't bring any expertise in this. I'm just an observer of what you're saying. I don't really know much about the second form of conversion therapy, although I understand what you're saying. That a psychologist or counselor might want to explore with a young person. Um, it, are you feeling? Is this about your attraction to the same sex, or is this um, because you feel that way, people are labeling you the other gender, and now you're feeling like you're a girl, if you're, a boy. I don't have knowledge to really comment on that very usefully. I guess. I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Well, in Provincetown, that's a traditionally mid to late 20th century style of recognition of sexuality, of homosexuality, unless it's changed very much. That was one of those places that people in New York, right after Gay Pride ended, they'd go to Provincetown or Fire Island. Those were the two top destinations to go and chill out after a week of partying. And this idea of sexuality was celebrated. There was no thought that, well, the gay conversion therapy of the past was derided, it was pushed away, it was rejected. And suddenly, years later, and currently, we're in the throes of this head-to-head butting. In the UK, Stonewall has had a lot of criticism over the past years, but there's a new organization, LGBT Alliance. And this is an alliance that's saying we have nothing to do with transgender identity. We wish them well, but we want to focus on sexuality and the fact that gay kids are still committing suicide and attempting to commit suicide at high rates. And we need to address that. We need to address other forms of homophobia. We don't need to conflate gender with sexuality because they're not one and the same. In fact, they're not even on the same planet. Are you seeing in Provincetown such a archetypical gay town in the late 20th century, that is? Are these ideas of gender ideology making it that way, such that speaking of homosexuality is now seen as anathema to the gay movement?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I'd say that the Provincetown is not different in that respect from London or New York. I mean, it's not an insular place that is still living in the 70s and 80s around sort of sexual liberation. No, I think that there are a lot of trans people here, and there always were. They maybe were just not as prominent. So I think the sensitivities around inclusiveness for the trans community and support for the trans community is just as much alive in Provincetown, and Provincetown has moved along in that direction as well as everyone else. It's not an isolated throwback or moment in time.
Well, certainly the people who identify as transgender today are everywhere, but there's a notion that somehow trans people or transgender people have always existed. And then there's this going back to Marsha P. Johnson, et cetera, whom I knew when I was living in New York. And he always said he was a transvestite. Somehow his saying this has skipped over in journalistic articles to his being transgender. So we seem to have left out the whole fun space of transvestitism and drag culture that seems to also get crushed in the rush to codify a transgender movement, if you catch my drift. I don't know if you've been to New York in the 90s, but there was a lovely bar there, Bardot, a huge transvestite club for singers, dancers, largely singers, and performers like Lady Bunny, Raven O, Joey Arias. And I worry that this new lexicon of internalized genders sort of taking over a lot of our gay history, because drag acts were part of gay culture. We sort of need to understand the difference between drag and what is today being called trans, no?
Oh yeah, absolutely. For heterosexual folks, this is very confusing. Uh, so you talk about the serious issues of trans community, and their minds immediately go to transvestites and drag. That's what they think. Yeah, Provincetown has had a lot. There was, and I think still is, I'm not sure, there always was a tradition in Provincetown in the fall, around October, of Fantasia Fair. And Fantasia Fair was a transvestite celebration for a week, where this was not. I don't think that it didn't have anything to do with women dressing as men. It was totally men dressing as women. And many of the men who came and dressed as women openly were, for all intents and purposes, heterosexual. They would come with their wives. The locals would say, "Oh, this is the week for the tall women." It was the transvestites. And it was effective for them because they could openly sort of buy frocks and shoes and accoutrements that They didn't feel comfortable going to Macy's to buy. I mean, and the vendors would come, and of course, they were all different styles. Some people wanted the, St. John suits, and others wanted frilly, you know, and it was a fun thing. It was called Fantasia Fair. And of course, today, I think that still continues. Today, the main entertainment venues in Provincetown are still about drag. It's still drag. And, I'm bothered by drag. I always have been, because I think it's based, I don't mean to be, overly serious here, but I think it's based on a hatred of women. I think it's based very much on a phobia about uh, women, and making fun of women, and over, characterizing, they're always tramps, or they're outrageous. I mean, it's fun. I don't mean to say I haven't enjoyed drag. I have, and sometimes it's very, very moving. Um, and the best are great, and some are just wonderful impersonators of, Judy Garland, or Marilyn Monroe, or whatever. They're very talented artists. Um, but a lot of the sort of street drag and those sorts of shows are sort of bawdy. I would say, the humor is based on anti-human.
A lot of the feminists and lesbians, in fact, intensely dislike drag for the same reasons you just mentioned. They also, though, have issues with the fact that drag was their number one hurdle to even get seen by lesbian and gay organizations, because there was an investment even there, even for businesses. Look at New York City. When I moved to New York City, there were a handful of places for women. There were dozens upon dozens within a 5-block radius of New York City. You couldn't throw a dead cat in the West Village
Hmm.
without hitting a gay bar, right? So I can understand where women are coming from when they criticize. Then the transgender movement hit forth not at girls initially, it was at boys and young men. You have an interior gender, that's what you follow. And for many lesbians, it was lesbians who pointed out the problems of transgender identity ideology to me about 9 years ago, when they said, well, this is about reducing women to a stereotype in the very same way that drag is. We're not blackface, we're not a costume. Feminist Janice Raymond has said this when she critiques Sandy Stone. So there's a lot of historical criticism of not just drag culture, but what used to be a very infrequent transsexual being. This idea that we're supposed to exceptionalize the person as a medical anomaly, but even though there's no medicine behind this, really. And on the other hand, now trans has grown from medicine to social manifestation, social contagion, depending on what experts you speak with. And somehow now everyone has a gender identity. But Tim, what happens if I don't? See, I don't have a gender identity because as a woman, as a lesbian, I've had to fight all of that nonsense. I've had to fight reductions about being gay. You men get it rough. You get murdered, you get beaten up. In many respects, you get the worst end of homophobia. Lesbians, we do get murdered and raped and killed at a lesser rate, perhaps around sexuality itself, because the more common manifestation is we find two men at a table with me and my girlfriend, and they're saying, so who's the man? And then, can I watch? You don't usually get that from men. So that whole gamut of our sexuality being both not codified in law, you mentioned sodomy laws earlier. It's unsurprising that in so many countries, lesbianism isn't made illegal at all because women's
Right.
sex doesn't exist, right? Our sexuality is not worth a law on the one hand. Meanwhile, you guys are getting stoned and whatever, beheaded. And then on the other side of that paradigm, paradoxically, in cultures such as the West in the last 30 years, we get fetishized, we get this single white female type of film. And those were really in the 90s, quote unquote, lesbian filmmaking was fascinating, to the Kissing Jessica Stein, which also deserves to go in quotes because that was so like two straight women. And that was really weird. And then if you remember Vito Russo's Celluloid Closet, lovely book, and then it's well worth to watch the movie version of his book, but it goes through very beautifully how gay men and women in cinema were represented, from the panic sex, the horrific spy espionage pieces out of Britain from the late 1950s and 60s onward, to Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn as lovers, and the suicide films, all these lesbians killing themselves, a few men killing themselves, Rupert Everett, his films, always MI6, fascinating stuff, sometimes filmically beautiful. But until people like Todd Haynes, gay cinema had, and there were a few exceptions, mind you, but gay cinema had this very liminal space of somehow having to codify itself. Even readings of Hitchcock's Rope, right? I mean, that's considered, according to people like Slavoj Žižek, to be this ultimate masterpiece of phallocentric filmmaking, right? All in one shot, too. So imagine the length has many metaphors, if you will. I do wonder, though, that in all of film history, it is women's films, it's lesbians' films that have been the most troubling and invisible on the one hand, or heterosexualized on the other. Things have gotten better the last since 9/11 in terms of gay culture. Democracy went out the window in one hand, but in many other respects, filmmaking, art, all of that somehow settled out. As you mentioned, the Defense of Marriage Act, and a lot of things sort of came to a fore when Americans realized, even conservative Americans, that this wasn't going to go away. So we needed to share the toys in the sandbox, as it were. But lesbians have been fighting a lot of the issues around the transgender narrative because they've been made to pay the price. Recently, I'll give you an example. On Friday, someone sent me an email that came to them from the dating app. It's supposed to be a lesbian and bisexual woman dating app called Her. Her is sending out newsletters to women. Friday morning, one of Her's users got an email with a link to click for one of their blog articles. It was a pharmaceutical intermediary company, a quote unquote clinic, but it's not a clinic, it's a fake clinic, a drug front that will not only supply women with microdosing of testosterone, but the article itself makes it so cool. It's almost replaced the club culture pre-COVID with methamphetamine, with now you can do tea. And men can, there's a whole pharmacy there for men who want to be women. So it's really troubling to me that now the very tools that are supposed to be serving lesbians and gay men are turning against them. And men are reporting the same thing, by the way. It's called the boxer short ceiling, where gay men are being told if they don't have sex with women who identify as men, that they are transphobic. And lesbians have been getting this for the last decade. I've been investigating what's called the cotton ceiling by lesbians over the last 10 years because so many reports have emerged of, wait, we can believe that there are people who want to identify as the opposite sex, but that doesn't mean I should have to sleep with them. And this is now the biggest problem, along with safety in women's prisons, the safety of women in sports, especially contact sports. How have you witnessed this from where you are in Massachusetts? Because it's not just about drag shows anymore. This lobby is taking on the very rights of lesbian and gay men, such that lesbians are being told that if you don't have sex with this man who has a female penis, you're a transphobe. I have just interviewed a woman who lost her job because of saying the simple fact of sex is immutable, men are not women.
You've obviously, know so much about this, Julian, that I'm not aware of, and you're educating me. So I'm kind of breathless in terms of I understand what you're saying. I'm just not aware of it. There used to be, back not that long ago, but more in my time, with the debate was at women's music festivals, safe space for women, to be women, and it was largely lesbian, right? Was it the Michigan festival and that sort of thing? Deciding that only cisgender women, not trans women, could attend, and that debate I followed. I don't know, I didn't have an investment in it, but I didn't know it's gone, to this length. I guess I do want to agree with you and reinforce your feelings about lesbians. As women who love other women and who are emotionally and sexually attracted to other women, as a distinct group, um, do lack standing, I think. They're, yeah, I feel, again, it's a lot of it is about money and power, and a person who maybe a trans woman just may feel more privileged than a lesbian in terms of asserting herself, and demanding, and really, really, really uh, articulating and asserting her rights, where lesbians haven't ever felt that kind of power.
A lot of these organizations, including the HRC, which has taken up a mandate of pushing transgender narratives, the ACLU has been putting out more tweets over the past few months on trans than on any other death row inmates. Forget it. That's what the ACLU used to do. But no, I think they'll be happy to tweet if a death row inmate identifies as transgender. But basically, their mandate has been to crash women's and girls' sports and to call anyone a transphobe, including, like, I'm far to the left, but the ACLU is more than happy to say that everyone who disagrees that men or boys should be competing on women's and girls' sports is a right-wing Christian Bible thumper. I mean, this is how it's going so far. These organizations know that many of us are very far on the left, and what it's done is it's fragmented various parties. Hasn't yet happened in the US, but definitely in the UK, women have left Labour. It's been going on for 3 or 4 years now. So Labour is likely to not win an election for some time because of this. Newer parties are being formed, but it will not surprise you that the Women's Equality Party kicked out women. Heather Brunskill Evans, a philosopher who was part of that party, got kicked out. Venice Allen, a member of the Labour Party, was kicked out. Meanwhile, there's a lot of questions going on about the ways in which transgender narratives and so-called rights are being fictionalized, in the sense of nobody would disagree that someone who identifies as transgender should not be discriminated against, should not be hurt, should have the same rights as you or me or anyone else. I mean, that's not even under discussion. The real issue is why in a woman's prison, now that men know they can transfer to a woman's prison if they identify as a woman, you're having thousands identify as women from the US to the UK so they can get transferred over. And then you have cases of women being raped in these prisons because the wokery, the capture of the transgender lobby is so great that even within the prison system, you have people that don't want to be perceived as transphobic. It's happening. And the HRC, GLAAD, these are two organizations that in recent years have been pushing for the visibility of trans people and have worked very little to not at all on the visibility of gay and lesbian people. Well, that is arguable. Do we need more visibility? Should we maybe be dismantling NGOs once we have addressed and remedied certain issues? These are discussions, I'd say, that need to happen. But what we're facing now are the clashes of rights. The clashes of rights where I, a woman, if I want to go to a homeless shelter, I do not want a man on the next bed to me, or a domestic abuse shelter, or a hospital ward. And the reality, Tim, is that more and more of these situations are arising because more and more men are identifying as transgender. Because as you probably know, with laws like the Equality Act in some countries or other laws, that a man nearly has to say, I feel like a woman inside, and he gets all the access to women's spaces. So we're going back to a very deeply deep-seated misogyny that's having real-life consequences for women that go well beyond drag. Like, I have problems with drag, but I'll take drag. Thank you very much, if you catch my meaning.
I think in the olden days, the police or the authorities allowed drag only if at the end of the act you took, you revealed, that you took off your wig. That was the old style drag, right? At the end, it was a reveal, so that it was entertainment and not fakery. Gosh, you give me a lot to think about, Julian. You're so steeped in this. I don't know how to comment. I'm just keep focusing in on the rights of women, whether they are lesbian or straight women who do feel vulnerable, I guess. Yeah, there's not a lot of debate about whether that's legitimate because it gets put among people that I connect with on the liberal side, on the left. It gets put into that basket of you must be for this or you're a transphobe. I don't know. I've pondered this, but it isn't affecting. I guess I'm lazy. I don't. It's not affecting me. I'm not thinking about it. But I don't. If I had children, if I had a daughter who felt very vulnerable because there there was a space where a trans girl or a trans woman was in a private space or competing on a sports team. I, I I guess I could understand a parent feeling uncomfortable about that. And, I mean, I think the left does sort of shrug it off and say, "Oh, grow up, and stop being so, allow all the flowers to bloom." There's not an issue here. So let them go into the girls' locker room and let them be on the team. I don't know. I don't know where the right, where the human right dimension comes into this, and where it's what's fair and what's not, and what's appropriate. I mean, you're right, because this is difficult because, as you just said, it's a clash of rights, and it feels like for one to win, the other has to lose. And fair-minded people don't like to think that way. We don't like to think for you to win, I have to lose. We want to make sure everybody wins.